Welcome to the Wooper Club League Season 12 Week 5 Power Rankings. The halfway point of the season is here and past. I am your host, IllLogic, coach of the Buffalo Bouffalant. As always, I'm joined by Steve, coach of the Waterdeep Wobbuffets.
Hey, everybody.
And before we get into the rankings and recaps, once again, we do have quite a few trades to go over. One team really dominating everything here. So I think before we go over the Incineroar, we do have to talk about a couple of their trade partners first. So we'll go over the Adams Pidgey Emporium first, who traded away their Annihilate, who was, I believe, their first-round pick, in favor of the Meowscarada. Steve, what does this do for them?
Meowscarada provides a couple things they really needed, one of them being speed. After trading away the Weavile earlier in the season, they really were lacking for speed. This gives them that top-tier threat that is additionally immediately threatening. They have a lot of threats on their team, but a lot of them are more setup-leaning, where they take a turn or so to set up, and then they can go to town. Meowscarada provides that immediate power they need, allowing for a different playstyle they previously did not have access to.
And the other trade that the Incineroar engaged in, they took away the Hydreigon from the Miltanks in exchange for the Ceruledge. Steve, you recall that the Miltanks had 3 dark types picked at the beginning of their draft. One of them is now traded away. What did the Ceruledge acquisition do for them, too?
The Ceruledge allows them to diversify their types. That is the big thing. Specifically, their first 2 picks were Roaring Moon and Hydreigon, both dark dragon types. So getting something different there to provide a little bit of type diversity, as well as some more physical power. Great Mon, and hopefully they're able to use it well with these different typings.
And of course, the Incineroar were involved in both of those, plus another free agent transaction. We'll go over them here quickly. Out is Meowscarada, in is Annihilate, out is Ceruledge, in is Hydreigon, and out is Orthworm, and in is the Brute Bonnet. A couple of very interesting trades here. Someone did point out he looks like he's starting to gather some Uber Mons here with the Annihilate pickup there too. The Brute Bonnet also very, very interesting, and Orthworm with some overlap there. Steve, do you think these are overall positive trades and transactions, or was this a big waste of time?
I would say they were overall positive, at the very least for the gameplay the Incineroar would like to go for. They were looking for a bulkier grass type and were able to get value out of their frail grass type while getting a bulkier one in the process. They were able to make a couple other upgrades. There are certainly some issues these trades present. It was brought to my attention before this recording. There's a little bit of a fairy weakness brewing now. But outside of that, getting arguably better Mons in all of these slots, at the very least Mons that were drafted earlier in the draft than what was traded away. So some great pickups, and hopefully with all of these gathering Ubered Mons, the Incineroar will be able to complete that comeback season.
And finally, we do have one transaction over in Paldea. It's the Wooper Troopers on the move again. Out is Armarouge. Geez, these Mons just cannot stay put, these fire-armored Mons. And in is the Toad Scroll. Steve, this seems a little bit odd, but it sounds like you have a beat on what they were trying to accomplish with this.
I definitely do. After our match last week, the Wooper Troopers had mentioned that they had a pretty big electric weakness, which I certainly did notice and agree to, previously only having Iron Thorns as a resist. That was part of the reason their Annihilate was Terra Ground in that fight, to get another Volt Switch immunity. And so the Toad Scroll pickup here is for that. Additionally, they have a little bit of a ground issue with only Iron Jugulus and Bronzong being immune and no resist to ground. So Toad Scroll being a really great pickup to help patch up both of those types, while providing additional removal outside of Glamora. Overall, probably a better fit for the cohesion of the team than Armarouge.
And most of these are teams that are in contention here. Let's see if those moves can work out. Okay, let's see what happened then in Week 5. As we start off in Paldea yet again, calling out Johto. Start getting some interesting matches going. What are we doing? The feature match of the week, it's the one I called out at the end of last week's video, the Akron Agrons and the Boulder Boulders, with the Boulders finally breaking through for a big W, handing the Agrons their first L. But there were some fire sets. You're going to need to go see the feature match to believe. Next up, we got a pair of 2-2 teams looking to take the next step in the power rankings. It's Quiet Majesty and the Wooper Troopers, with the Majesty taking the W. Turn 1 double switch out of the offensive Ruin Mons. Very cool. Toxapex gets a Toxic onto Vaporeon, then Serena putting in some work, gets Glamora low and removes all its hazards. Toxapex stalls out, Bronzong screens a bit before getting in as Pothra. Is Vaporeon the answer? Calm Mind, Protect. Stored power only does 41% before Yawn comes off, but Vaporeon is down to 35 and Toxic. Chen Pao takes Toxic 2, then eventually Glamora breaks through finally with Sludge Wave, getting the poison on Serena before it can spin, which will take it out. Chi respawns with the Dark Pulse for Vaporeon. Espathra is back in. Now it's a Roar from Arcanine for the Espathra. Very nice. Chi takes out Glamora, but is poisoned and gets Rock Scott up there. Careful now. Bronzong gets Sylveon low, but it got off the Wish into Espathra for yet another attempt at the sweep. Calm Mind Speed Boost. Crit the Arcanine behind the light screen for the KO. Can Chen Power Revenge? Terra Fire to resist the Ice Shard. Terra Blast that down. Stored Power the Tauros. Terra Fire the Bronzong. And that's game. That's a 5-0 for the Majesty. Next up, we've got the Waterdeep Wobbuffets taking on the Close Combat Club, looking to bounce back, but the Wobbuffets will not be denied a solid 4-0. Early rocks up from the Sandy Shocks as Grimmsnarl sets up a Reflect, but here's Gengar, Trick, Amoonguss, the Choice Specs. Oh, snap. Orthworm takes the Spore, some switching around, but Steve gets in Gengar on an Ice Punch, and that's a freeze. Iron Hands is now very tough to switch into, but maybe Sandy Shocks is just as tough, chipping everything. Quaquaval in to break some screens and KO the Grimmsnarl, but gets T-Waved in response. The Frozen Gengar then sacked to the Iron Hands, setting up. Then Sandy Shocks back in. Volcarona switches in. No boots, and down it goes. Amoonguss can't switch in either. Iron Treads, Terra grounds into Rapid Spin it too late and outspeed the Sandy Shocks, but Steve gets them back into the switching game. Sack the Quaquaval to at least get half of Palafin's health down. Then Earth Power from Sandy Shocks can finish off the rest of John's team. Very clean win from Steve. And finally, one of the matches of all time with the Zigzagoons and the Kinglers. The Kinglers grabbing their first W of the season. Early, Slitherwing gets a couple of close combats off to KO Garganachi, whose parting gift are a Sandstorm and Salt Gear. And then Dugtrio is outsped and KO'd. Let's go, Slitherwing. Goldango takes care of that, and then does most of Slowbro's health, only to find out that Trick does not work when you're good as gold. Rotom does most of Corviknight's health and KOs the Slowbro. Then Goldango takes out Gothitelle in exchange for half of its health, but it's low kicks time. Swords Dance on the switch into Rotom. Trailblaze to boost speed. Oh, we're in it now. Terra Dark Throat Chop to KO Rotom. It does more than half to Greedent, stopping the classic Protect Belly Drum, then KOing that. Sucker Punch finishes Goldango, and finally one more Throat Chop for Espeon, a 3-0 win off of the best Route 1 bug. I said it, fight me. And with the number 1 seeded Newport Noctilles on the bye, that is what happened in the Paldean Conference. Over in Johto, we are set up for an iconic matchup between the undefeated Seattle Steamrollers and two-time defending champion Route 1 Burbs, the last two finals recompeting, and it was over before Turn 1 started. A 6-0 by the Route 1 Burbs. What happened? Well, those of you with a keen eye will note that Pelipper is not Drizzle. That means it's sacked early to Chen Pao. Chad's fighting back. Play rough from Grimmsnarl. Does half to Tinglu. Screens up. Iron Moth is in next. Floatzel tanks Fire Dance. Not outspeeding, though, without the rain, and not hitting Slowbro too hard despite the crunch. Salamence is the answer there. D-Dance, Iron Head, and on the parting shot, Brook Break into Dragon Claw KOs Rotom Heat. Get some boots in your fire types, people. Iron Treads, Terra Bug, Megahorn into the Slowbro, but Terra Water for Slowbro. How do you break through this thing now? Calm Mind, Slack Off, Surf, Psyshock, just one of those KSOs. Floatzel. Oh, Cinderace, Gunk Shot does over 50, but of course Slowbro can swap out to try again later. Tinglu KOs Cinderace anyways. With only 2 left, Slowbro back in, KO the Iron Treads, Grimmsnarl down to rocks. That's a clean sweep from the Burbs, probably with or without rain, to be honest. Next up, a couple of teams in the hunt for the top 4, the Music City Mudkips and the Cincinnati Incineroar. This is just one big repeat. Another 6-0 for the Incineroar, their second of the season. Garganachi wearing down Great Tusk to start. Forces out Breloom, Bullet Seed into Annihilate. That is a strong Rage Fist ready to go, but a disciplined switch into Fortress first. Appreciate that. Spinning away the rocks, too. Espathra, Terra Fairy against Iron Jugulus. Hurricane misses on Calm Mind 1. Swap into Clodsire and Calm Mind 2. Stored power does over half. Gunk Shot miss the second stored power KOs. Slowking looks like it can take a couple, but in return, Psyshock doing a whole 25%, 40 after a crit? Roost is the last move on Espathra. That is a Clam Mine, the WCL Classic. Up to full special attack, special defense, and speed. That means stored power Oko's Slowking, the resist, special defense wall. Goodbye Breloom and Iron Jugos with Dazzling Gleam, and goodbye Sea Titan and Great Tusk. A 6-0 from Espathra, giving it 10 KOs between the two leagues this season. See if you're allowed next season. Next up, the Summit County Psyducks with the layup match against the winless Adams Pidgey Emporium, except it's the coming out party for the Emporium, grabbing their first win against the now 3-2 Psyducks. early on a good switch into Booster Energy, Iron Valiant on a knockoff, then Volcarona against that. Taunt the Volk to stop Quiver Dance, but the Hurricane instead. Zach forgot to renew his Showdown Premium and it hits and KOs the Valiant early. In return, Power Gem Sandy Shocks to KO the Volcarona. The only KO by a losing team in Johto this week. Insane, by the way. A bit of back and forth, but it's looking like Corviknight will be tough to break through thanks to the Rocky Helmet. Sandy Shocks answers. But Ditto? That immunes the electric move and Stealth Rock back. Very funny. Goodra brings Toedscruel low, and after it had to come in and spin, Meowscarada is able to KO that. Corviknight comes in on Scizor every time, Sandy Shocks on that every time, and anticipating the Ditto, we now have double Baxcalibur, easy read, Terra, Fairy the Baxcalibur, Ditto backs, Glaive Rush does nothing. But instead of taking the KO, Dragon Dance up. Ditto just switches out and Baxcalibur is out. Ice Shard does nothing. Ditto back in on +3 backs. EQ will of course KO that. Scizor in, Corviknight in. Skeledirge in, Toxapex in. I see how it's going here. Ditto Skeledirge, but the original is Toxic. Ditto putting in the work. It comes to Toxic. Ditto in on Sandy Shocks to be immune to T-Bolt. They're both locked in. Ditto to Stealth Rock and Sandy Shocks to T-Bolt. Eventually, Ditto's out of Stealth Rock. The struggle KO. 3 KOs for that Pink Blob. Adam's first main league win. And finally, the Lairon staying the course with a big 6-0 win over the Miltanks. Turn 1, Bravebird KOs Amoonguss. Turn 2, Bravebird KOs Cerulege. Staraptor is a beast. Final Gambit from Dugtrio does less than half to Iron Hands. That was a decision to make over EQ. That's fine. Roaring Moon is into Outrage. No. Terra Fairy Iron Hands to immune that. Drain Punch to restore most of what was lost to Memento in the first place. A couple more hits to KO low kicks, chipping the Rotom Wash a little bit, some pivoting around, get it to sleep with Dondozo, and then the Focus Sash Glamora to finally grab the final KO. And with your Buffalo Bouffalant on bye, that is what happened in the Johto Conference. Quite a few upsets. You may have noticed that we put the upset side on the opposite side. We had a total of 5 out of 8 unexpected results here, but that doesn't mean that the power rankings are too surprising here. Not too much of a shakeup. We've still got the Noctels up at 1, the Agrons at 2, the Quiet Majesty at 3, and the Waterdeep Wobbuffets at 4. No need to talk about the Noctels with no match this week, but the Agron's Majesty was actually a bit of a discussion for us. The Agron's finally taking an L, and the Majesty with a relatively easy win means that we could have shaken things up. We kept the Aggron up there at 2, Steve.
Yeah, the Agrons, the big thing here is the head-to-head win. So they have suffered now a loss that may have shaken our confidence for them and forced a discussion, but they still have the head-to-head win over Quiet Majesty. And all in all, one close loss isn't going to keep them out of here. After discussion, an easy enough choice to keep the Agrons here at 2.
And the Majesty still continuing to impress. They have quite a tough schedule, actually, looking at everything through here. Even if our playoff odds tend to go by just a 50-50 result, you have to imagine the Majesty are favored in most of their remaining matches. So I think they're still in a pretty good spot here, Steve.
Yeah, the Majesty are doing great. They have played all the other teams in the power rankings. They've played most of the up-and-coming teams, this week taking on the Wooper Troopers. So the only game I believe they haven't played yet is the Boulder Boulders in terms of teams that we have been discussing these past couple weeks. Outside of that, playing some of the teams that have been struggling this season. So really favored to win a lot of these remaining matches and should more or less be a clinch for the playoffs.
And then speaking of those boulders, we had a little bit of a discussion here too between 4 and 5. We did ultimately decide to keep you here at 4. No reason to really penalize you for a W this time, but we do also need to mention the boulders who are starting to come on a little strong, and that was a big win for them. Talk to us about you remaining on the power rankings and what we're looking at from the boulders moving forward here too.
So yeah, the Wobbuffets picking up a win against a struggling close combat club. Additionally, with the head-to-head over the boulders from week 2 certainly helps in this regard. Maintaining the course, do have some key losses to other in-contention teams, but the record is good enough to stay. For the boulders, getting the big win over the number 2 certainly will help them out, but we need more big wins than just the one. Being the underdog and winning once is going to be great, but without other wins, they won't get to the record needed to make the playoffs. Once we see another one or two, another one is probably enough, another big upset to get them on, and should be enough to make the playoffs in that case as well.
I think that is kind of a big factor here. There are most of these teams, it looks like, from this about 2 through 5 or 6 range or so, have at least one big win there against each other. Whoever can get that second one first, I think, will emerge out from this group next. But otherwise, not too many changes here. Let's go over to Johto then, where we did see a couple of big losses and a decently big shakeup here too. The Steamrollers, we did decide will stay at number 1 for now, followed by Bouffalant, the Lurian Lairon hanging in there at 3. And a newcomer for the first time in Season 12, the Row 1 Burbs, defending champions, finally making it on at 4. But I guess first we have to talk about the Steamrollers and Bouffalant here. Steamrollers with one extra game and one extra win, but this week was pretty ugly after all of our praise we heaped onto them last time, where we said their reign looked uncontested at this point. What do we think now?
Well, it's hard to tell if their reign is still uncontested in terms of the weather they prefer, as they forgot to bring it. That has happened before in the league. A regular season match is certainly better than other times it has been forgotten, but it's a loss. It really doesn't hurt them overall too much, considering how strong of a season they've had already. But overall, that one extra win in there kind of gives them the edge over the Bouffalant for now. And even if they just cruise the rest of the season, they should certainly still make the playoffs.
And we can touch quickly on the Lairon here before moving on to those other folks too. Lairon, another win, 3-1. There is a point where we're going to have to say that they're looking pretty solid here. They've been in the rankings here, I think, every single week as well. Probably the biggest pleasant surprise of the season here, probably along with the Quiet Majesty. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, they have had a great season so far. One of the surprises, starting from that week 1 upset of the Burbs, their schedule has been a little easier. Of note, they haven't played the 1 or 2 yet, the Steamrollers or the Bouffalant. So those games will be quite telling here in the future to see how long-lived this position will remain. But as for now, they are doing fantastic and holding on to that number 3 spot pretty uncontested.
And speaking of those Burbs, we had a little discussion here too about 4 and 5. The Burbs did make it on here for that big W. We're not attributing all of that to Chad's inability to bring Drizzle. I think their game plan did look overall quite good. They played probably their best game of the season at a time that it seems to have mattered the most, bring them back up to 500. But we also do have to acknowledge the Incineroar there did make a lot of our discussions there tough, and I think they slot in right beneath it. But the Incineroar are so tough to gauge too, with some 6-0s and a couple of 0-6 and 0-5 losses too against the top teams. What do you think about these two?
Yeah, the Burbs, I believe, get the edge here simply on the historical strength. I mean, the back-to-back champion right now, surely that gives them a little bit of edge in our rankings. The Burbs also kind of have a history of starting the season a little slow and then picking it up towards the end. So although we haven't discussed them previously, it seems to make sense that now they're starting to heat up just in time to get enough wins to make it to the playoffs and progress from there. So all that looks well. The Incineroar, we've mentioned this, very hot and very cold. They have been playing, some of the top teams when they were cold, so it'll be interesting to see them in some of these closer matchups they have to see how they end up and if they get those key wins in those more coin flip battles to secure a playoff spot.
And there is one team that's missing now, the Summit County Psyducks, who started off 3-0, now missing from these top 4 rankings. Steve, a couple of pretty bad losses, including one to a previously 0-4 team. Is there still hope for the Psyducks to bounce back?
There's definitely still hope. Having the 3 wins in the bag is, great to have. Only need, it is possible at 3 and 5 they could make the playoffs. Another win or 2 would go a long way. But just from what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, the team seems to be falling apart. It'll be interesting to see if they are able to recover and get, such a strong start of the season means they only need to, limp across the finish line to make it into the playoffs. It'll be interesting to see if they can pick up that extra 1 or 2 wins in these next few weeks.
And speaking of, I suppose we should go back to Paldea very quickly here to talk about those playoff odds. Noctowl's remaining at 1. Don't think they changed all that much, but I'm sure there's a lot more movement all throughout here, Steve. What are we looking at?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of movement here. The Noctowls, again, not much of a change. The Agrons, with their loss, don't really impact their playoff odds too much. down 4.7% to 89.6. Having a lot of wins, being towards the end already, one extra loss doesn't really drop things too much. We could see them start dropping further with more losses. The Wobbuffets and Quiet Majesty are remaining close, both with a win this week, going up around 19% to 81.7 and 81.5% odds of making it. The Boulder Boulders with their win made it up to 61% chance to make it. The Troopers with the loss down to 41.7. The Kinglers with their win helping out a lot here, getting up to 27.6. The Close Combat Club dropping to 26.2. And the Zanesville Zigzagoons at 10.3. Nothing particularly interesting in terms of the odds. They roughly make sense. Those top 4 teams all at above 80% chance odds of making it. Certainly looks good for most of those teams, and it'll be a question of if the Boulders and the Troopers are able to make it in, or if any of the other teams are able to make a huge run here at the end and lock up one of those remaining spots.
And then over in Johto, something I saw very interesting on here. Yes, Chad takes a loss, but I think the updates to these numbers will kind of show the power of getting to 4 wins overall. That seems to be a pretty magical number here in terms of getting your playoff odds way up there. What are we looking at with Johto?
So, as you mentioned, the Steamrollers, even though they lost, only dropped 2.5% down to 94.6. The Buffalo Bouffalant remained pretty much stagnant with the bye. The Laron with a win getting on par with the Bouffalant up to 84.6. The Psyducks with their loss dropping to 71.1. I mean, this is kind of what we were talking about the Psyducks. They still are a favorite to make it into the playoffs, even though their play does not look spectacular right now. Of course, they can still miss out, but odds are still with them as long as they can win some of their games or other matches go their way. The Music City Mudkips at 52.5, the Route 1 Burbs at 52.4, the Incinerator at 52.4. All these teams right clumped together, all 2-2. It'll really be interesting to see when these teams play each other, who's able to make it out of this 2-2 area and get up into the 60s and 70s in terms of playoff odds. And then towards the bottom, the Pidgey Emporium with their win getting up to 7.5, and the Miltanks dropping to 0.0%. A note for the Miltanks, it is rounded to 0.0. It is not eliminated. There are 6 out of the remaining 65,536 possibilities where the Miltanks make it into the playoffs. They're not out. It is just very difficult. They must win out. There are certain games that must go the way they want. I believe there's a total of 8 games that have to go the way they want. 3 of them, of course, being them winning. 5 of them being other ones where they need a specific team to win or lose. Additionally, in all of these outcomes, there are always 8 or 9 teams making the playoffs with a massive tie at 3 and 5. So the Miltanks still have a chance. Unlikely. They will be the easiest team to eliminate this upcoming week, with a simple loss removing them from the playoffs.
As much as I think we would all like to see a 9-team playoff in a 9-person league, one of us does have to try and get the W this next week as we move on to the Week 6 matches. That is me, of course, trying to face the Miltanks. But we're going to start in Paldea yet again because of the feature match over there. Steve, what are we looking at? What interests you over in Paldea for Week 6?
The biggest match of interest is definitely the Agrons and the Wooper Troopers. We mentioned that in Paldea, the 2 through 6 are kind of a contested jumble of teams right now, with all the teams having wins and losses to each other. These are 2 teams in that group. So as we mentioned, getting 2 wins over other teams in the group is kind of a big milestone to hit. So this will be a big match for both to either help themselves get in or keep the other out of possible playoff contention.
And the other one that may not jump off of the page here, but I think is still very interesting. I get to go back to the Boulders yet again, but this one maybe more so because of the Close Combat Club, who really have been struggling this season. I think this is maybe their last chance to really climb back in to the playoff mix. They have a team that looks like they may be on the rise and has been team building and playing pretty darn well, as opposed to, say, the Boulders trying to, if they do get this W, it doesn't look like a big win, but this is still an historically strong team, and getting that W would be huge for them, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it just from the records. over in Johto. There are probably a couple matches here that jump off the page to you, but the number one for me is the Burbs and Incineroar. We talked at length about them being 4 and 5, the Incineroar being super hot, super cold, in particular getting 6-0'd and 5-0'd by the top two teams. Well, here's the other top seed right here, the Route 1 Burbs. This is your chance to jump up above them into the power rankings and potentially stay there for a while, as opposed to the Burbs who are on the up and up, looking to make another big splash and potentially move up the power rankings a little bit if anyone above them slips up. Steve, what's another match that looks good to you in Johto?
Well, I could talk about the Steamrollers and Lairon. They're both in a pretty good position right now. While the match is still important, I would like to highlight more the Mudkips and Psyducks. These are both teams we discussed kind of being either free-falling or fighting to get in there at 2-2 and 3-2. Pretty big match where I would say a win is definitely more or less needed for the Mudkips to keep their playoff hopes alive, while it would be very beneficial for the Psyducks as well. Will be an interesting match to see how these teams are able to compete with each other.
Looks like Johto is finally set up to snag a match of the week. We'll see if we can get that to happen. Thanks again to Steve for joining me. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to check out the feature match. The Boldors and Agrons was a blast. Hope you get to go check that out on this channel too. But otherwise, we'll see you back here for Week 6.